Good evening. Or good morning, whichever. We are going to be in the book of Genesis, so if you want to turn your Bibles there, that is where we are going to camp out in the story of Joseph. I want to, before we get started, I have to say welcome, because I'm the preacher, and on Sunday nights we don't have a welcome, so that's my job. I have to point out that Garrett and Lindsay Bender are here, and so if you didn't see them already, you need to give them a hug, because it's always awesome anytime we get to see some friends that we've known a long time ago or grown up with or known since we were little kids and had excursions with. That just is always a good time. I want to also give, I don't know if I hate doing this, but I have to do it because I want to give a little bit of a disclaimer on this lesson. I was learning about some of this stuff, and as I was learning about it, I was just, like, it was a lot of information. And, a less mature previous Joseph from, last month or 2 months ago would have made this one lesson and had it be 58 minutes long, all right? Or longer, honestly, probably longer. Now in my maturity, I'm going to cut it up in half, and we're going to try and make this 2 parts. So a couple of things are a result of that. One, the payoff, the really awesome, exciting payoff, will come next time we talk about this. There's still a lot of really beautiful stuff that we're going to look at tonight, but the really, to me, the most powerful part of the story of Joseph, we're going to talk about next time. Also, we're going to look through some of this, and we've talked about some of it before, but we're going to try and, with this lesson tonight, focus on sort of the first half of the life of Joseph. The other thing that is important about that is we've expanded some of this stuff, so we're going to, because I decided to do 2 lessons, we're going to sit in this first half, but we're also going to bounce a little bit back and forth in the beginning of Genesis as well. So with all of that, I want to say, let's dive right in, because the story of Joseph is an incredible story. When you read through, or when you're reviewing the book of Genesis, you usually go, well, I did this with the kids actually, when we were for our devos. You got a couple of main things you need to remember. Number 1 is Adam and Eve at creation, right? You can remember them by people in the story, right? Adam and Eve at creation. And after Adam and Eve, you go to Noah's Ark, right? That comes really quickly after that. Then after Noah's Ark, the next person you interact with is Abraham. And then after Abraham, you have Isaac. And then after Isaac, you have Jacob. And then after Jacob, for some reason, never mentioned in the rest of the Bible when they reference Genesis. They talk about the God of our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But then there's this really important guy at the end of the book of Genesis named Joseph, which is a great name, if I say so myself, right? And he ends up being, like, from chapter 37 all the way through chapter 50. I mean, that's 13 chapters dedicated to this guy's life. That's a significant portion of the book, and he's kind of the last part of the book of Genesis that you look at. Now, a couple of things that are really cool about this. The first thing is that, like, if this much attention is dedicated to the story of Joseph, like, it is going to be a very important story. There's going to be something about this story that it has a significance to it, okay? The other really cool thing is one of those significant things about this story is that it draws on all kinds of stuff that has led up to it. In the book of Genesis, you've got what seem like a bunch of, like we just went through, a bunch of individual stories, but they're not. I mean, this is one work. Really, it's 1/5 of the Torah, which is like its own complete work within, you got levels of complete works in the Bible, but Genesis by itself stands alone, and when you get to the end here with the story of Joseph, what you end up seeing is that littered all throughout this story is imagery and ideas and concepts that have been introduced in the other stories. And as we go through, we're going to try and look and connect some of those and kind of see how the story is really being told. And next week, or next time we get to study this, we'll have the complete payoff to it, because it's really cool. I don't know. Tonight's lesson is really cool too. Next week's lesson is really, really cool. I don't know how else to put that. But we're going to dive in. Genesis chapter 37. This is where you kind of get a shift in the language. We've been talking about Jacob. He's been the primary character. He's had several children. And then you get to chapter 37 and verse 1, and it says that Jacob lived in the land of his fathers, sojournings in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. Now, something I was learning when I was learning this stuff is the guy said that phrase, if you go back and look at where that phrase is used, these are the generations of, that's usually a signal to the reader that we're shifting gears, right? We're moving into a new chapter, you might say. Although that wasn't, the book wasn't written with chapters originally, but it was written with these ideas or these signals to let you know we're moving into a new story, and this is one of those signals. Let's keep reading in verse 2. Joseph being 17 years old, all right? How many of you guys know brilliant 17-year-olds with great judgment, a lot of wisdom, great life experience? They make great choices all the time. A lot of them? I mean, obviously, my parents knew one at least. But, you just don't know a lot of 17-year-olds with... In fact, car insurance companies are aware of this. And as soon as you turn, I think it's 21, your insurance payment goes down because 17-year-olds are dumb. And 21-year-olds are less dumb? That probably doesn't track. But definitely 25, you get a big discount there. So he's portrayed right here. We're introduced to Joseph in the story, and he's introduced as being young, right? Young. 17 is not old, even at this time. This was not considered someone who was wise and full of years, but he was a young guy, only 17 years old. And notice it says that he was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. Now, again, look at the description. He's a shepherd, and he was a boy. Right? It doesn't call him a man. It could have, but it calls him a boy. And so you have this picture of Joseph at the beginning of the story as being a young guy, inexperienced, youthful, and it might give us an idea as to some of the decisions he makes later in the story. Look at verse 3. Now Israel, that's Jacob, loved Joseph more than any other of his sons. Okay, time out right there. Have we seen anything like that in the stories leading up to this? A parent loving one of their children more than the other children. As a matter of fact, we've seen it a couple times. Let's read this next line. Because he was the son of his old age. Okay, have we heard of a son of his old age anywhere else yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we're talking about kind of two separate categories here. Favorite kids and the son of his old age who was a favorite kid. Well, all you have to do is go back to Jacob. Joseph's father was one of the kids that his parent loved more. You remember Jacob's mom loved him more, but Jacob's dad loved Esau more? And that caused some problems. In fact, it caused one of the brothers to want to kill the other brother. That's not a great dynamic. And then you back up a little bit more, and Isaac was more loved by Abraham because exact phrase, he was the son of his old age. Okay, so you've got this idea here. What about another story where there are two brothers and one of them is favored and one of them is not? Let's go all the way back to chapter 4 with Cain and Abel. One of the brothers' offering is favored and the other is not, and the one who wasn't favored was upset by this. Okay, so we've already got these ideas. If you sit down and read Genesis in one sitting, which is a tall task, but if you do it, you're going to pick up on more of these ideas because this idea of a favorite youngest child is not new. In fact, it's been done several times already throughout just the book of Genesis. But the last thing, and this is sort of an addition to what we've seen previously, is that Jacob, or Israel, gives Joseph a symbol of his favoritism. And he made him a robe of many colors. And so Joseph not only is his father's favorite son, not only is he the young one, this young guy who is favored by his father, but he's also given a symbol of favoritism, which is called a robe. Who wears robes? People in the morning who they're getting ready for work, but also back then, kings, right? There was a symbol of royalty to wear a robe. And so Joseph is being put in a position by his father of prestige, of almost royalty within the family, okay? Verse 4, but when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. They couldn't even have a peaceful conversation with their younger brother because of the way that his father favored him over the others. Now Joseph, verse 5, had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, hear this dream that I've dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. And his brothers said to him, are you indeed to reign over us, or are you indeed to rule over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words, right? Okay, so you've got tensions brewing between the brothers, and they cannot stand Joseph because his dad loves him more, he's given a position of favoritism, and because he has these dreams, and because he's dumb enough to tell them these dreams. Now listen, there is no indication that Joseph has done something wrong by telling his brothers these dreams. But there's every indication that it was an unwise choice, right? That sounds like a 17-year-old kind of choice, to go tell your brothers this dream that may or may not have them bowing down to you in it, when they already don't like dealing with you and can't speak peacefully to you. Hey, we can't have a peaceful conversation. How about you and I talk about this dream I had? Horrible decision. Okay, but again, it doesn't seem as though he's done anything wrong simply by telling them this dream. He didn't have the dream himself. He didn't make it up. He wasn't instigating. Rather, he's making a terrible choice. Verse 9, then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers. I mean, you just think, go tell it to your dad by yourself, you know? Just do this, pull maybe your mom off to the side and have a conversation with her. Don't tell it to the 12 or to the 11 older brothers that you have who all hate you. Don't do that. But he does it anyway. He told it to his brothers and said, behold, I've dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. But when he told it to his father and his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, what is this dream that you've dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you? And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in his mind. So again, you've got this idea of Joseph being in a position of authority over his family in his dreams. Another significant note here is this phrase that the sun, moon, and stars, the last time we saw that was in Genesis chapter 1. And at creation, and the sun, the moon, and stars were meant to rule the day and the night. And that's significant because Joseph is putting himself in his dream in a position of authority or rulership. Notice what his brothers said after the first dream. They said, are you going to reign over us, or are you going to rule over us? So they understood the imagery. They're like, you think you're going to be a ruler, some kind of authority, some kind of powerful person over all of us. And if you look at the position that the dream has Joseph in, it's a position very high up, right? He's all the way up in the sky, like in the night sky with the sun, the moon, and the stars. So this is a very high position that Joseph has in his dreams. He's put in a high position in his family as the favorite child with the robe, all right? And then from where he starts, verse 12 begins the descent that you'll notice. Okay, so verse 12, now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. And he said to him, here I am. So he said to him, go now, see if it is well with your brothers, with the flock, and bring me word. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem, and a man found him wandering in the fields. And the man asked him, what are you seeking? I am seeking my brothers, he said. Tell me, please, where are they pasturing the flock? And the man said, they have gone away, for I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. Now, again, can we think of another story that involved brothers in a field? It's the same exact language from Cain and Abel, that Cain went and met his brother in the field, right? So that's got to be on your mind right away. We've got hatred between brothers, a strained relationship, a favored child over the others, and now they're in a field. We're doing everything except for saying, hey, this is supposed to remind you of Cain and Abel, okay? So verse 18, it says, they saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. Guess what that word kill is? Kill, like murder. Guess where else it's found? The story of Cain and Abel. It's the same word used to describe what Cain did to Abel. So you've got this exact scenario replaying itself. And again, we've got Joseph depicted as a young dummy, for lack of a better description, who is making poor decisions, but not doing anything wrong. In fact, doing exactly what his dad asked him to do. Go find your brothers. And not only did he go out and look for them and come back and say, I couldn't find them, but he went out, looked around, got help from somebody. He had to ask for directions, and then he goes and he ends up finding his brothers, just like his dad instructed him to do. And his brothers plot to kill him. Verse 19, they said to one another, here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Now, the title of the lesson, Dad absolutely correctly assumed, was from The Princess Bride. You remember like halfway through the movie, that guy says, the pit of despair. Don't even think about trying to escape. If you've seen it, you remember the pit of despair. It's this awful place where they torture Wesley. Anyway, this is the same idea, being in a pit of despair, that we're going to see start from this point forward in Joseph's life. It says that they were going to kill him and throw him. So the plan is murder and then bury the body in a hole in the ground, throw him into a pit. And then, here's their idea, then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what becomes of his dreams. Do you remember how God described sin when he was talking to Cain? All right, it's crouching at the door. It's like an animal. It's ready to devour you. Man, we've got the image of Cain and Abel all over the story. All right, so this is their idea, to murder him and then to lie. They're going to devour, they're going to lie and say that an animal devoured him. And then sarcastically, we'll see what becomes of his dreams. Verse 21, but when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, let's not take his life. And Reuben said to them, shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him. Now, this is a little bit off subject, but there's this really interesting thing where in Hebrew, if someone says something, no one says anything else, and it says, and he said to them, it means that there was an awkward silence or there was no response from who he was talking to. So when Reuben said, hey, let's not take his life, and Reuben said, the response is, hey, let's not take his life. Let's not. Okay. Like, make your case, because that's a terrible idea. All right, so, and Reuben said, they didn't have anything to say to that because every single one of his other brothers wanted to take his life. And then he says, let's throw him into this pit, and then don't lay a hand on him. And then we get a little note that he might rescue him out of their hand and restore him to his father. So Reuben's plan was throw him in this pit. I mean, I hate him too, but let's not kill him. And we'll beat him up. We'll throw him in the pit. And then I'll come get him later and bring him back to his dad. That was Reuben's plan. But I guess without Reuben's full knowledge here, his brothers had another plan. So verse 23, so when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty, and there was no water in it. Ah, man. Okay, so we've talked about this a long time ago, but I think it was back when we were talking about John. Water is a symbol all throughout the Bible. Water is a symbol. It's a symbol for several different things, but one of the things is that water is something that brings life. In Genesis chapter 2, the earth is described as like this desert wasteland, and a mist comes up from the ground, and then life begins to sprout. Genesis chapter 2. If there's no water in this pit, the idea is there's no life in this pit. This pit is death, right? Because that's what they wanted to do to their brother, was to kill him. So the desire was to throw him into a pit, send him down into into death. The other thing here is that what's the first thing they do to him when they get a hold of him? Well, they tear off his robe. What was the robe a symbol of? His status, right? So at the beginning here, we have Joseph in his dreams, exalted, clothed in a robe, favored by his father. And now at this point, he is stripped of his robe, stripped naked, thrown into a pit. Not just not in the heavens, but now he's not on the ground. He's like beneath the ground, right? So you can actually see the trajectory of where Joseph is in his life. And there was no water in it. Verse 25, they sat down to eat. Now, what a bizarre detail. It's not a rabbit we're going to chase tonight, but that is such a strange detail to have in this story. One idea I heard for it was that it might be a reference to Genesis chapter 3, when Adam and Eve ate the fruit of the garden, especially because of all the deception that is going to come about after this. But again, not something we're going to chase too much tonight. So they sat down to eat after they've thrown their brother in a pit, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels bearing gum, balm, myrrh, on their way to carry it down, notice that language, down to Egypt. And Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hands be upon him, for he's our brother, our own flesh." Now he has a moral compass when he could make some money off of his brother. And his brothers listened to him. And then the Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. Notice, silver is what Joseph was sold for. They took Joseph to Egypt. So you've got this idea here of going down to Egypt. Two things. One, it was geographically probably down most of the way, probably downhill, because the country where they were would be more hilly, more elevated, and Egypt would be probably a downhill hike. Oh, you call it a hike. A downhill excursion. But also, this is the first idea of someone going down to Egypt and being exiled to Egypt. That's exactly what's happening to Joseph here. Two things that we have to talk about when we talk about exile. In Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve eat of the fruit of the tree that is where in the garden? What is the word? It says the midst of the garden, or the middle of the garden. There's this geography of the garden, a mental geography, that in the middle of the garden is where God is. And the further you get from that, the further you get from God. So there's this lateral closeness to God that you have in Genesis chapter 3. Because what is Adam and Eve's punishment after the garden? They're sent out of the garden, a lateral sending away. When you see Genesis chapter 11, and you see the people building the Tower of Babylon up into the heavens, they're trying to build a tower up to God, and God says, look at these little guys, let's go down, right? Let's go down and see what they're doing. And the idea is God is up, and so the further down you get, the further away from God you're getting. There's this idea of being exiled or being taken away from the presence of God, both laterally and vertically, okay? Joseph got two helpings of it, right? In the beginning of the story, he was sent out of his home, away from his father, out into the field, okay? Now he's being sent out or away down to Egypt. Also, he's described as being thrown down into a pit and being sent down to Egypt. So you've got Joseph being typified as an exile in every sense of the word. Not the exalted reigning in the heavens and the stars and the moon and the sun like he was in his dreams, favored by his father, wrapped in a robe, clothed, but then down and out. That's how you should put it, right? Joseph was literally down and out of his father's home, out of his land, in a different land as a slave in Egypt, down in Egypt. Okay, so let's keep reading. In verse 29, Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit. He tore his clothes and returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where shall I go?" Then they took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, dipped the robe in the blood, and they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to the feet of their father and said, "This we found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not." and he identified it and said, "It is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." So the idea here that Jacob says is that an animal devoured his son Joseph. But if we use the imagery from Cain and Abel, the animal of sin devoured Joseph's brothers. Isn't that an interesting twist on the way that Jacob sees this? Especially knowing that Joseph was not actually dead at this time. So Jacob tore his garments, put sackcloth on his loins, and mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall," notice the language again, "I shall go down to Sheol to my son, mourning." Thus his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. So Jacob's perspective of his son Joseph is also the same. The image that Jacob has of where his son is the same as the story has been building to. It's down. He's down in death. He's down in Sheol. And he said, "That's where I'm going to go as well, and I'm going to do it mourning. I'll never be comforted," is the idea here. So Joseph ends up being sold as a slave to Potiphar. We're going to skip over Genesis 38 because we always do that. And we're going to jump to Genesis 39. If you've read Genesis 38, you know why we're skipping. Genesis 39. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt. Notice the language there. It's constant. Down to Egypt. And Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. Notice, God was with him, but he was a slave in a house of a master. He was not someone who was in his standing like at the beginning. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he had made him overseer of his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and the field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. So Joseph here, again, he's never described, is that even a word? He's never described as being raised up, right? He's never described as being brought up or put up. The language here is still down, and it's not hard to understand because at its core, the story we just read is a story about human trafficking, right? I mean, the story we just read is a story about someone who is taken from their home, sold into slavery, taken to another place where they're all by themselves without any resources or any people or any family or any comfort or anything, any ability to take care of themselves. I mean, this is a story about brothers trafficking their brother and selling him into what their father describes as Sheol or the grave. And Joseph here is described still as being down in Egypt. At the beginning of this story, he was down, brought him down to Egypt, or brought him down there. And yet, God's with him, and he allows him to have success even down in Egypt. Here in the back half of verse 6 is my favorite verse in the whole Bible. It says, "Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance." You just can't beat that one. Verse 7, "And after a time, his master cast her eyes on Joseph and said, 'Lie with me.' But he refused and said to his master's wife, 'Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except for you, because you're his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?' And she spoke to Joseph day after day. He would not listen to her, to lie beside her, or to be with her. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house were there, and none of the men of the house was there in the house." That doesn't sound grammatically correct. That broke my brain a little. "None of the men were in the house. She caught him by his garment, saying, 'Lie with me.' But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. Pause real quick. What was the first thing Joseph's brothers did to him when they caught him? Stripped his garment off of him, right? That looks pretty similar as to what Potiphar's wife has done to him. She's stripped his garment off of him. And soon after this, we'll see the trajectory continues. And as soon as she saw, verse 13, that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us, and he came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard it, that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house. Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, the Hebrew servant who you have brought among us came in to me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house." So she's got her bases covered, right? She's got the smoking gun. She's got his garment in her hand, and she kept it by her, right? Now, this is maybe a little tangent. I may have actually talked about this with some of you before, but do you remember what was the guy's name? Smollett. What was his first name? Jesse Smollett, right? There was that big scandal that some white supremacists came and beat him up and put a noose around his neck and poured bleach on him. It was huge. Like, the news was covering it like crazy, and they were like, "This is awful, this is horrible." And then it turned out he hired some guys to do it. One of the things that struck the officers who responded to the scene the most was that when someone is assaulted in that way, the vast majority reaction is to get everything that has to do with the assault off of them. Run away from it, get away from it. But he left the noose on his neck, which of all the things you would think you would take that off. And so they were already having red flags go up about that. Potiphar's wife, if this was true and she was truly going to be assaulted by Joseph, would not have held on to his garment. She wouldn't have stayed there and stayed and showed. And this is like, she's acting like someone who is guilty. And she's come up with a story to cover her bases, but she needed that evidence. So she hangs on to it. She tells her husband, Potiphar, that this is what happened. And verse 19, as soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, "This is the way that your servant treated me," his anger was kindled. Pause right here. Has Joseph done anything wrong? Nope. The best you could say, like the best case you could make is, well, if there were no other men in the house, he probably shouldn't have been in there either. But again, is that wrong or is that dumb? Like, the best argument you can make is that it was a bad decision by a guy who was already depicted as being very young in the story. He hasn't done anything wrong. His whole life in this narrative, this whole story about him, he has not done anything deserving of what he's going through. He's not done anything wrong. And yet, verse 20, Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. So now, just think about the level of exile, down and out, like we said, the level of exile that Joseph is now put into. He is away from his home, right? He's out, away from his home. He's out of his father's house. He's in a foreign land. He's down in the pit from his brothers. He's down in Egypt. Now he's down and out in prison. He's in prison in a foreign land. They don't care about you when you're in prison in a foreign land. The only people that care about you are the people from, like, the place that you're from. They might care about you. But if you're in prison in a foreign land, you might as well just live there. Like, set up shop. No one cares. Because he was a slave. He's not an Egyptian. And he's accused of doing awful things. Who cares if he's guilty? We'll just go get another slave. Joseph is in an absolutely hopeless, absolutely down and out position. And verse 21 says, "But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. And the keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed." Now, chapter 40, we have the timeline, but just skip all the way to chapter 41 and verse 1. After Joseph was in prison, we know that the cupbearer and the baker were thrown into prison as well. They had dreams. Joseph interprets them, and we're going to look at those probably next week. But in chapter 41 and verse 1, it says, after 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed, right? So two full years later. Exactly how much time has passed from when he was sold to when he gets thrown in prison? Not sure. But from the time that he's in prison and interprets the dreams, who knows how long that happened, but after he interprets the dreams, you still have 2 more years of this guy being as exiled as he could be, in prison, by himself, in the pit, out of his home, for 2 years, having done nothing wrong. Having done nothing wrong. And that's where Joseph ends for our lesson tonight. He ends down and out. His brothers sold him for silver. They lied to their father. They deceived their father about what happened to him. They killed him just like Cain killed Abel, essentially killed. They threw him into a pit just like Cain. They hated him in the field. I mean, you've got all of these stories from Genesis. And this is where the payoff is next week. But you've got all of these stories from Genesis, building and building and building, the language from them being woven into this story here about Joseph. And you know, when you read a book, when you get to the end, you're supposed to have the climax of the story, right? We got it. We got it in a big, big way here in the story of Joseph in Genesis. But for tonight, I want to notice a couple of things, just 2 really quick things, and then we'll be done. The first one is what I always say, not if, but when. I've probably told you about this before. A guy had a rodeo t-shirt on. He rode bulls, and it was not a matter of if you get hurt, but when and how bad. When we sign up to be humans, it's not a matter of if trials come. It's about when and how bad and how we'll deal with them. Jesus says in John chapter 16 and verse 33, he said, in this world you will. It's a definitive statement. You will have trials. Isn't that interesting? In the same book, John said that Jesus came so that we could have life and have it more abundantly. And also, you're going to have trials, no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Those seem like contradictions, right? Those seem like contradictions. But here's the deal. He's saying so much, well, we can't get into John right now because we'll be here for 4 hours, but he's saying so much more in the Gospel of John than just, well, yeah, you're going to have great life and it's going to have trials, because those two don't reconcile. But here's the truth that we really find from the story of Joseph. Sometimes absolutely nothing of what we have done, based on absolutely nothing of what we've done, we'll find ourselves in difficult positions, horrible positions. I mean, like I said, this is not just a story of a difficult family relationship, although those aren't fun if you've experienced those. This isn't just a story of someone who moves out and is away from their family, although that can be really difficult the first time you do that, or the second time, or the third time you do that. This isn't just a story of someone who was born into a difficult situation and they had to, didn't have a way to raise themselves up, like socially. This is a story about a kid who was so hated by his brothers, not because of anything he did, and was trafficked. Like, human trafficking is what this story is. He was sent into a foreign land and eventually falsely accused of sexual assault and thrown into prison for what is a minimum of 2 years plus. And he didn't do anything to deserve it. He didn't do anything wrong in this story that says he should deserve that kind of thing. And so if Joseph can experience this kind of difficulty, there are going to be times in our life when we experience things that we didn't do anything to earn. We didn't do anything to deserve. But here's the real takeaway from the story, is that at Joseph's absolute lowest point in his entire life, down and out of his father's land, he is the picture of an exile in Egypt, in prison. It says that the Lord was with him. God was right there by him. So when John says, I came so that you can have life and have it more abundantly, but also you're going to have horrible trials, like that's going to be a thing too. What he's saying is, yeah, you're going to have trials, and I'm going to be right next to you through every single one of them. All throughout the Bible, God's presence is life. God, his breath is life. His presence brings life. And so if John says, Jesus says that he came so that we can have life and have it more abundantly, what he's really saying, mixed in with like chapter 14 and 15, where he talks about I and you and me and we and us and you and me and the Father and the Spirit and the Spirit and you. Remember all that in John chapter 14 and 15, 16? Okay, what he's really saying is, no matter what the trial is, no matter what's going on, take heart, I've overcome the world. I came so that you can have life and have it more abundantly. I came so that you can have God with you and in you, no matter where you are in life. Amen. And if you have him in you and with you, you've got life, and you've got it as abundantly as you could possibly want. The story of Joseph reminds us that no matter where we are, no matter what's going on, no matter where the storm is, doesn't mean it won't hurt. It doesn't mean it won't bring us to tears. And it doesn't mean it won't be something we wish is over soon. But no matter where we are, God is right there with us. If we are his child, and if we are in him, like he is in the Father, and the Father is in Jesus, and Jesus into the Spirit, and the Spirit is in us, go read John, like chapter 14 through 17, and try and keep track of it. Because it's like a cat jumping around a room, how many in yous and in us and in we's. And that is the fabric, the woven fabric of the relationship that we get to have with God through Christ and through obedience to his word. So tonight, that's the message. If we read this story about Joseph and we've watched his trajectory from all the way up here in his dreams, in his home, all the way down into the pit of despair. You'll never watch The Princess Bride the same, right? All the way down into the pit, all the way down into a prison in a foreign land, trafficked by his brothers, hated by his brothers, thought dead by his father. God was still with him. Of course, if we peek ahead, we know the rest of the story, but I promise you, it is way, way cooler than you can even believe. So tonight, simply put, remember that even in the pit, God is with you. It's not if, but when. In this world, we'll have trials, but because of what God's done through Jesus, we can have God with us in every step of this life. So if you aren't a Christian tonight, which is probably not most of us, you can be. And if you've been walking on your own, just remember, God doesn't want you walking on your own. God doesn't want you going through these trials on your own. He wants you to be there with him, and he wants to be with you every step of the way. So if you need the prayers of the church, if you need the encouragement of the body of Christ to be with you every step of the way, whatever you have need of tonight, come let us know, and we'll help you while we stand and sing.